Hello, CS-25. In this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 3, Part 3, which is Unit 5 lecture. So in this week, we're going to touch on a few things, including cooling component for CPU, a little bit of drives, and we're going to touch on other components inside your system. So as we completed in the lab, we started looking at some of the internal components along with your processor. So your processor is mounted under a cooling unit, which is a heat sink, and it would have a fan on top like is shown in the picture here. And the CPU runs very hot. It is one of the most expensive component of your computer, so we want to make sure that it's going to be cool as it's operating. Now, on top of the CPU, we want to put thermal paste, or what they call thermal grease. That will allow the CPU to dissipate heat and send that to the heat sink, which is mounted on top of the CPU. For the fan, it acts as a cooling component, as the fan would be sending out the heat from the heat sink to the internal case, and then eventually the case fan would circulate the heat outside of the computer. Some of the heatsink are passive, or they are fanless, and passive heatsink does not include fan compared to active heatsink. Active heatsink would have a fan. So you do have some fanless heatsink as is shown on the picture here. So a heatsink that doesn't have a fan on top, that will be a passive heatsink, and a heatsink that would have a fan on top, that will be active heatsink. So on a motherboard, what you see with the North Bridge, which is another chip near the CPU, you would find that it would have a passive heatsink. And heatsink simply is a thin metal device that is absorbing heat from your processor and be able to reduce the heat for the processor. So we want to use the heatsink on top of any chip that would have a lot of heat. So now when you're using an AMD compared to an Intel, you notice that the socket would be different, as you're required to also use different heatsink. So make sure that you are looking at the compatibility of the heatsink for your processor. And on the heatsink, you would notice that there would be the thermal paste, or sometimes it doesn't include the thermal paste on the bottom. So this is the area where it pointed as number 4 is where you would apply the thermal compound or the thermal paste. And you can purchase that from online or a store like Micro Center where they sell computer parts. So we want to put the thermal paste before we apply the heatsink on top, or mount the heatsink on top of your processor. And we want to also seat the processor correctly and tightly before we've done that. So here we would see that some heatsink already come with thermal paste compound, so you don't have to add additional. And when you add thermal paste, you want to use a small amount, like a tip of your pinky, and scrape it evenly, and do not allow it to ooze over or drip over the other area of the heatsink or your motherboard. So here it talks about what thermal paste would be and how to use it. So we want to make sure that we use the thermal paste with your heatsink. So let's address some of the question in the assignment. The difference between the vertical and horizontally mounted heatsink is that the vertically mounted heatsink sends air up vertically to the case fan of the CPU. Where the fan is on top of the heatsink, it's going to send the hot air up. And the horizontal mounted heatsink, it's going to circulate air horizontally to the side of the case fan. So it's going to send the heat to the case fan instead of up to the case fan. So there are two ways to really circulate the hot air. And so when you're using a vertically mounted heatsink, it's going to send it up to the other case fan, where if you're using horizontally mounted heatsink, it's going to send air horizontally to the side of the case fan. And the difference between the active heatsink and a passive heatsink would be that the active heatsink consists of a fan, where the passive heatsink does not include a fan. So when you're looking at a heatsink, you can determine whether it's active or passive by the absence or the presence of the fan. For number 3, why is thermal paste used in installing a heatsink? We would use it to keep the CPU cool, and it also acts as an adhesive to the heatsink. So, and again, we don't want the thermal paste to be excess where it drips over your devices. So we want to apply a thin coat of it on top of the CPU, in between the CPU and the heatsink. So here are some of the details, and you can also refer to your notes from page 1, 2, and 3 for heatsink information, thermal paste, and CPU fan. You also find liquid cooling system in your computer, especially one that would be aimed for higher use like gaming. And liquid cooling system is a way that we can use the pipe to pump the cooling liquid to the fan area where it's going to be able to cool down the processor. So the unit, you would see it something like this. You're still going to have a fan mounted to the heatsink, but it's going to act as the liquid is going to cool it down versus what you see entirely with the heatsink and the fan. So it does run a little cooler. Now, if you do have a leak, that's going to corrode the system, which is going to affect or negatively affect your components. So you got to be careful when you mount that. Next, we're going to talk about expansion card. An expansion card would be any adapter that you can attach into your system internally through a bus. A video card is an expansion card, and to install video card, you would want to shut down the system. We want to physically mount the video card onto the slot, which is what is shown here. And most of the video adapter that you see, not all, but you would see its own CPU, its own PSU connection for the power supply unit, where it has its own power connection. And in the back of the adapter, where it will be mounted to the case, that will be where you plug in your monitors and your screen. So we want to turn off the system, physically install the adapter. Then we want to configure the BIOS by booting the system and go into setup. And then we want to, after we save the setup information, we want to go into, we load the operating system, go to device manager and configure the driver. Even though Microsoft puts the generic driver there, you're going to find that you won't be able to use the full capability of the adapter unless you install the driver. And you can download the driver from the manufacturer website. So in BIOS, we can configure the card by setting it to be on a certain slot or bus. So if your adapter is attached to the PCI Express, we want to make sure that it sees it on that bus, or we configure it for that bus. Some adapter would use VGA, and we would then need to make sure that the VGA setting is used, and that's on the older graphic card. And VGA just stands for Video Graphic Accelerator. Now, before we install a new card, usually you would have to remove the old one. So shut down the computer, turn off the display, disconnect the cable, open the case, disconnect the cable to the card, the adapter, and then we would want to remove it by unscrewing the mount of it from the case and then pull it from the slot. Then after that, we would then put in the new adapter, plug the cables in, mount in the screw, and then configure in BIOS and configure in your operating system. So here it shows you some of the area where you can see that you would need to screw that into the side of the case right there. And it is pretty obvious where that would be mounted. However, you want to make sure that the pins are touching the bus, and it needs to be mounted fully, not loose. So here it talks about how to install video adapter. Once we physically install it into the slot, we would screw everything in, we would connect the cable, including the power and the data cable or for the monitor, and then we would then turn on the system, configure BIOS, configure driver in the OS, and you should be able to use it there. So driver installation is here. And for Windows, you can simply search Device Manager like this. And in Device Manager, you would see Display, and Display is located here. So if you have a display adapter, it would show that here. So install the driver, you simply right-click. You can go to Properties, and then go to the Driver tab. And if it doesn't have the appropriate driver, you won't have the details here, but it would show a little exclamation point in yellow. So we want to configure the driver and make sure the device is working properly. Now, in your assignment, let's answer the question here. It asks you, what are some of the characteristics of a good video adapter? The characteristics of a good video adapter is going to be speed. So how fast is the GPU, which is your graphic processor, and then how much storage does it have? All video adapter would have some dedicated storage, which known as VRAM. What is the size for that? So the higher the gigabyte, the larger the storage space. That will give your adapter capability to store more and process more graphics. And then the cache size on it, how much it's able to temporarily store. How many ports, how many connection for your monitors are going to be available, HDMI, displays, the type of ports are important. And also if it has cooling units like fans, because it tends to run hot, so we want to make sure that we have the appropriate fans and cooling units from the processor. For number 5, it asks you, why do you need to install video adapter driver? It's because the image will not have proper resolution if you don't have the correct driver, which is the software for the hardware. So we want to be able to make sure that that hardware is doing its job by having the appropriate software to be able to control that particular hardware. So it's important that we install driver to make sure that we have the proper resolution and use that device to its fullest. And so for number 6, it asks you to look at the question. A sound engineer wants to add a sound adapter on his PC sound capturing project. The PC motherboard has PCI Express 16 and PCIe X4 slots available. Use your computer browser to visit the internet to locate a sound adapter for the engineer. The cost of the sound adapter should not exceed $300. So we want to get a good sound adapter. So we want to say sound, we search for sound adapter, and we can go for the X16, PCIe X16, and we want to have sound capture. So you will see that there are quite a few, and on average we would see them at least $50 to higher. So we have a budget of $300. So we can go for something like this, and this is sold on Newegg. So you would have a sound blaster, and for pro gaming, this allows you to interface for sound, and you do have other options under that brand. But we want to take a look at the description. So it's able to interface with PCI Express, and this is the 4X, not the 16. And it is 32-bit with 384 kilohertz. So here it gives you a little bit more detail. So you can choose something like this, or you can go and select another options. So if we want to use something that is a little bit more analog, we can do that, but you want to pay also attention to the type of connection that it would have. Uh, so you want to be able to find some of the options there. So I selected this one, but we can also look at other options here. And this one has your some higher performance connection there, but it has some the optical connection there, but you would need to make sure that you check the port. So the lower the price, you would see that it doesn't have all the type of connection. And then if you want to select other options on Newegg, you do have like things like this where it's just straight use analog. So you can have an analog option, which is very cheap, but we want something that's going to be more digital. So we can safely say that we want to go with something like this or better. So once you locate your sound adapter, you want to provide the information here for number 6. Then in the next portion, it goes into installing a sound adapter. Similar to the video adapter, you have to shut down the computer. You would look at the expansion slot, what's available. Once you already have the adapter for the expansion slot, then you would install it onto the slot and then make sure that you screw it in on the case and then connect the cable. Now, if you already have a sound adapter already installed, you have to remove it and then put in the existing one. But before you remove it, you have to shut the system down, make sure you ground it, make sure that you disconnect the cable and unscrew it, and then you can remove it. So usually you would see sound adapter being installed into the smaller slot compared to the PCI Express. Then for external USB, you can use external USB for audio sound, for wireless, for Bluetooth, for a lot of different things. If you're using a USB audio sound card, you would need to plug that into your USB port, and your system normally would detect it and it would tell you that the device is ready or not. But if it doesn't, you would then need to go to Device Manager and make sure that you see if it's recognizing any type of device, and then you wanted to update the driver for it. So here it shows you how you can configure the sound card in Windows 10, and we've done some of this in our lab for our exercises. So you would then also check out Mac OS and other operating system, because you want to make sure that you know how to do this if you're using a Mac OS or you're using a Linux system, which sometimes your client or your business would have other type of system outside of Windows. So here it walks you through the step on how to do that on page 9. And you can also use your expansion slot to install network adapter. In the case that you need a network adapter, if your system doesn't come with it, or if you want to have another network adapter or a wireless adapter. So it tells you that you need to shut down your computer, make sure you've grounded, locate your slots, and then you want to remove the slot cover so you can screw that in. And then you want to put in the card into the slot and then put in the screw, and then reconnect the power, restart the system, and then update the driver. So let's go back to the assignment, and it asks you to, to explain how you would install a plug-and-play USB wireless adapter. So you would plug the USB into the USB port, and then you would need to install drivers, okay, and drivers ask you after. In the book it says before, but you want to say that you want to connect it after. If it's not able to configure, you can configure. Otherwise, the reason why they say before is because you sometimes Windows might put the driver that it thinks would be best, but you can always update the driver with the new one. Okay, so either way, you have to install the driver for your plug-and-play USB wireless adapter. So here it touches on how to install USB network adapter card. Now, just to come back to the USB, we talked about this before. You can have bus powered USB, which is using your motherboard to power your device, or you can have self-powered USB or self-powered system or components where it would have its own power connection. So here on page 10, we would find the instructions on how to install USB card. And in the next section, it talks about your hard drive, which is SATA, or external hard drive, which is eSATA. And SATA stands for serial ATA. It's a way that we would connect the drive to the system. In the lab, we looked at some of the SATA cable connecting to the hard drive. And on this page, it gives you a list of different SATA 1, 2, or 3. Currently, we're using SATA 3, which connects at 6 gigabit per second. Then you would see the connection like this, and you notice that it has an L shape, and so you would use the cable to connect. And now this has a different type of cable where sometimes you would have a flat SATA cable, and then sometimes you would have like you would have a different kind of cable where it would be either edge, or it would have a way that you can connect in a rise like this. So SATA is used for not just hard drive, but it also used for optical drive. And when you're looking at the cable, you would see the label where it would tell you what kind of SATA cable it is, even though they look almost the same. So it is a one-to-one connection. You cannot have one-to-many, so one drive to one connection. And so when you're using SATA 3, you're using transfer rate of 6 gigabit per second. SATA 1.5 is only going to be 1.5 gigabit per second for one. And then SATA 2 is going to be 3 gigabit per second. And so when you were using SATA 3, it's going to be twice as fast as SATA 2. Now, you would see the SATA cable like this. And in the back of the drive, you also need to have a power cable, which is a larger L-shaped connector. And you know that the power cable always have the colorful wire. And so we want to make sure that the power is connected and the data, which is your SATA cable, is connected. You have the SATA Express, which is SATA E, and this is a revision of the SATA 2. It's a little faster than the other one. It is actually at 16 gigabit per second for the max speed. You do find motherboard that supports SATA Express, which is equivalent to PCI Express, that it uses that bus. However, most likely we would find more commonly SATA, but if you find a motherboard that supports SATA E, you can use it to attach your drive, and your drive, if it's compatible with SATA E. So in the next question, we want to look at some different type of cable. And in the connector that's associated with the wire, this is an ATX Molex Mini. This is used for a smaller drive like floppy. This is a 4-pin, and we want to label. So for number 1, that's called the Burke connector, or the Molex Mini. The ground cable is going to be in black or brown. And then the positive cable is going to be in red. And the yellow cable is going to be your 12 volts. So let me move this down here. So to go through, The connector is called the BERT or the Molex Mini. The ground wire is going to be number 2, that's the black or the brown. And then the positive volts, the 12 volts is going to be number 3, and the 5 volts is going to be the red. So as it needs 12 volts to drive the mechanism of the actual drive, so you would also need a 12 volt there. For number 9, it asks you what type of SATA has the interface speed of 6 gigabit per second. That will be your SATA 3 or your eSATA 3. Now, you can only connect one cable to one drive. So for number 10, it asks you, can you connect more than one SATA drives to a single cable? No, you can only use one cable per drive. It's a 1-to-1, and the note said that. For number 11, it asks you what is the data transfer rate of SATA E or SATA version 3.2. That will be 16 gigabit per second. And number 12, if Lily wants to set up SATA drives in her PC and it is a hot swap drive, what should Lily do? Hot swap drive just means that you can actually remove the drive while the system is on, and you would use this on server system quite a bit. So to replace the drive without interrupting the system is that we would need to do the configuration of the drive for AHCI mode in the BIOS or UEFI. So you would enable this mode in BIOS, and that will allow you to use your hot swap drive. So when you set that up, you need to make sure that you enable AHCI. Okay, and here it talks about that there for hot swapping. This is on page 13. So in the next part, we're going to talk about peripherals, which are printers, and CompTIA will ask you about different type of printer, how to troubleshoot printers. So it's really important that you know different types of printer. So printers can be standalone. That means that you only connect to it from your computer. It's not shared with anything or connected to any other system. It can be networked where you can put the printer connecting to a switch or your home router and be able to share that across many systems, your print services. And the printer can also work on its own where you can plug the USB into it or use a micro SD and you can print. So there are different types of printer. Laser printers are very common business. Inkjet printers are more for home use. Sometimes they're referred to as bubble jet or desk jet, but ultimately it's inkjet. And you can share or you can use it as a standalone. Other type of systems or peripherals are also flathead scanners or flatbed scanners or ADF. And flatbed scanners are just a way that you can feed the sheet in and it will scan, where the scanners would use what's called optical recognition technology, where it would recognize everything as images. So scanner documents is essential in businesses, especially for companies that require signatures, that require certain forms to be completed. So you might have a multifunctional device that would print, scan, fax, and copy, and it would use a flatbed feeding type of mechanism where you would feed the sheet from the top. So now when we work on these, we want to make sure that we check the drivers. We want to make sure that we look at the connection. Sometimes that they also use USB ports. Sometimes they are able to use Wi-Fi. And if they're wireless, and then sometimes they're also using NFC, which is near field, and that just basically using radio frequency. Another type of scanner is your barcode scanner. This is commonly used in retail stores. And barcode scanner can be used to scan items that would have a certain type of barcode, whether it's RF type of barcode or it would just be digital type of barcode. We can also use it for QR scanners, so you would have different type of scanner would be using barcode reader, laser scanner, and then you also have CMOS readers or CCD, which is a handheld gun where you would scan this, and you would see this at the retail store where you would do a self-checkout or when you're using a cashier service. So QR stands for quick response, and quick response code can be used in many different ways, where it could be for URL, but it could be for a certain type of product information. Companies would use this to track inventory sometimes. So this is important. And as we troubleshoot these systems are connected to your computer via USB or sometime through a certain port, and they also require driver. So in the next question, we can answer the question, what type of resolution for multifunctional print and faxing copy of the device? And that will be your 2400 DPI, which is going to be dot per inch. So you would have 2400 dot per inch. And this is your typical resolution. Not all the system will have 2400 DPI. Beside printer, monitor, we would want to identify 3 different type of devices. So in the next section, it talks about virtual reality headsets. You can have barcode scanner, you can have speakers, microphone, mouse, keyboard, optical drive, and projection. Now, VR headsets are becoming more popular. So VR headsets can be used to train people, can be used for educational purposes, can be used for entertainment, engineering, and constructions. In the case of in some medical facility, VR headsets is used to train surgeon, and in other case, we would see that being used for educational purposes. So in the VR is going to give you the immersion effect where you are inside it, and it would be using a head-mounted device to cover your eyes, and that way you would fully see the actual virtual reality environment. Then you also have LED panels for each eye, which is located inside the HMMD. So that way it would give the visual feed of your eye movement to, so you can do the 3D visualization through the HMD. And for the array of the headsets, it can use the range, you can put in a smartphones, or you can connect it to a computer and be able to use the app on the computer to run it. As you would see with Oculus, or if you buying the smartphone mounted one, you can use your smartphone screen and attach it to that system. So for optical drive, we talked about this when we touched on the previous chapter or the previous unit, CD, DVD, and Blu-ray. They can also be connected via USB, not necessarily through the SATA connection or other ports on your computer. So if you might be able to use an external DVD burner to be able to copy CD and DVD. Your mouse is used to have input in the system, and there are different type of mice that's in the market. You can have wireless, you can have wired, you can also have specific feature, or you can also have Bluetooth. So in that sense, mouse is also a peripheral device along with your keyboard, which is used for data input. On your laptop, you often see touchpads, and touchpads would be used to as a way to select or input the data, very much like your mouse. It has the same functionality. And then in the business environment, you also have signature pads where you can sign for certain transaction or forms. There are game controllers, so we can use joystick, we can use mouse, keyboard, or the actual controller with buttons. And game pads and joysticks are commonly connected via USB or Bluetooth. And more frequently than before, we definitely use camera and webcam. So if your system doesn't come with the mounted in camera, then you can purchase a USB based webcam and be able to use it as a way to record your video and be able to also transmit sound that way. Some webcam actually incorporated microphone and speaker, but some doesn't. So microphone can be used to have voice input. You can put it into the 3.5 millimeter mini jack, which is the round connection in the back or in the front of your case. You can also use microphone that is USB based. So we want to make sure that we check the sound setting on the OS that we're using, whether it's Windows or Mac. And here on page 17, it walks you through the steps on how to configure the microphone settings in different type of operating system. Another peripheral device is going to be your speaker. It's how you can display audio. We can hear sound from the speaker, and we can use 3.5 millimeter connection, which is the round connection. You can also use mini jack. You can use SPDIF, which is optical connection. It's faster and somewhat more reliable than the analog. Then you can also use HDMI or proprietary cable and ports. So on the bottom of 18, it walks you through on how to configure your device for playback and check your speaker. And you might have headphones or headsets where you can listen to music or sound, and we can connect this via Bluetooth or USB or the analog audio jacks. And projection sometimes is used with a screen, and projection is now normally using HDMI, DVD, or DVI-D or DisplayPort. Commonly, you would see them in these ports. And then the older projection would use the old graphic adapter, which supports the older graphic type of connection, like your VGA in blue or black. So projection, the important part is to really change the brightness and the clarity of it. So the typical value for the CDC panel is about 250 CD per M2. So then it would be measured in lumens, how bright it is. So on the average projection is going to be 3000 lumens or higher. So the higher the lumens, the brighter it can be. And while some projections are mounted, others will be portable. And then you also have external storage drive. External storage drive just sometimes uses eSATA, or sometimes it just uses USB. It's used to store files and information that you need from the system. Now, in an environment where you would have only one monitor, one mouse, and one keyboard, but you need to connect many desktops together, you can use a device called KVM, which is keyboard, video, and mouse switch. It's allowing you to be able to share keyboard, mouse, and display monitor across multiple systems. And it's simply be able to switch over for the system that requires the I/O connection, the input and output connection. So in the next question, we would say that the printer monitor, outside of those, we would have VR headsets, barcode scanners, speakers, microphone, mouse, keyboard, optical drive, and projector or other type of peripherals. And the KVM switch allows us to connect a single keyboard, display, and mouse to two or more computers in that physical location. So we can share mouse, keyboard, and monitor across multiple systems. So in the next section, we're going to talk about power supply. And we had visited this area when we work on the lab this week. And also important to point out, I forgot to mention this, that KVM switch, you need to make sure that you configure the drivers for the device that are connected, and also otherwise it will not be able to recognize the connected monitor, mouse, and keyboard. Other peripheral would be magnetic reader or chip reader, smart card reader, biometrics reader, and so on. So we could go to an endless number of different type of peripherals. So in the next section, power supply. Power supply is a unit that is taking your main power connection from your outlet or your surge protector, and then be able to distribute it to the rest of your components inside your computer, including your hard drive, your processor, and your motherboard. It converts high voltage AC, which is alternating current, to low voltage direct current, which is DC. So it's PSU, power supply unit, is designed to convert AC to DC. And it's used to distribute to all the connected components inside your system. So on this page, page 21, it shows you the type of what a power supply would look like. And you would have many connector to the power supply. So you would use it for various things such as drives, motherboard, fans, etc. Now, power supply ratings is important. It separates the positive 12-volt rails in dual rail design. That would give you more than 2 of the 12-volt outputs, which allows you to have many different type of components that require positive 12 volts or higher. So when we look at the power supply in the back, it would be rated for different region of the world to use based on your voltage. 115 volts to 120 volts is going to be United States or North America. And in other part of the world, like Asia and Europe, you would see that it's rated as 220 to 240 volts. So in the back of your power supply, there would be a notch where it would set under 115 compared to if you use that power supply in different parts of the world. You would then push that setting to 220 volts. So here in the United States, we would use 115 to 120 volts. And that allows it to support dual voltage power supply range. Now, for the power supply that does not bear the UL in certification marks should not be used. So if it doesn't have it, then or that means that the safety is unknown. It is not rated for dual usage. Okay, so for your typical smaller computer that on desktop you would have about 220 to 300 watts, and then it will go higher to between 400 to 500 watts for the bigger desktop. And the switch for the voltage is located here, as I mentioned before. And then your on and off switch is here. So when you turn off the computer, you got to drain the power by switching the on and off switch in the back. The form factor for the power supply is important because it also ties to how many pins you can use to connect to the board. And the motherboard has a form factor, and the case is linked to that as well. So if we're looking at the ATX family, you would have power supply that will fit for that form factor. 24 pin is used by ATX or micro ATX and mini ITX, where some of the older system that will be ATX would use 20 pin. So the way that they design it is now they would do a 24 pin with the 20 legacy pin and the 4 detachable pins. As what we've seen in the picture of our lab this week. So the 4-wire square for the ATX 12-volt connector, that will be for the motherboard, that's called the P4. Okay, and we label that in the lab this week. Okay, so as you can see here, it provides you the information with different types of connector. The 12 volts is going to be the secondary, that's for the motherboard, auxiliary secondary, ATX primary, that's also for the main power for the motherboard, and then ATX 12 volt 2.2 primary, which has 24 pins. Some connector would look like the picture shown below, where you would be able to see the 24 pins, the ground, and so on. So power supply should be connected to your peripherals like your hard disk, your optical drive, sometime your expansion card like your video adapter. And here it gives you another picture where it shows different types of connector. So let's label the type of connector and answer the next few questions. For number 16, it asks you, what is the purpose of the power supply? It is used to convert from high voltage alternating current, which is AC, to low voltage direct current, DC. What kind of voltage range is supported by the dual voltage power supply? 115 to 120 volts and 240 volts at 50 hertz. For number 18, why should you avoid using the power supply that does not have the UL certification? When it's missing, the UL certification is missing, the safety is unknown and it might not be safe to use. For 19, what is the difference between North American and European ratings in power supply? 115 volts to 110 to 120 volts, 60 hertz AC is for North America. 230 is for European and Asia in that they use 220 to 240 volts at 50 hertz. For the connector, you can refer to the notes or you can look at it here. So for number 1, we would have ATX 12-volt secondary. Number 2, we would have AUX secondary. Number 3 would be ATX primary 20-pin, which is older on the older system. And number 4, ATX 12-volt 2.2 primary 24 pins, which is used on the newer motherboard. When you're replacing the power supply, what should you consider? We want to use at least the same wattage and the same pinout. So it needs to have the same power supply connectors, the same pinout as the original. It should have the same form factor, shape, size, and switch location as the original. And it should have the same or higher wattage as the original. And it should support special features that's required by the processor, motherboard, and SLI support. So high levels of 12-volt power pin would be EPS 12-volt 8-pin power. Now for 22, we did some of this in a lab where we would determine what would be the necessary wattage for your power supply. We want to add up all the wattage ratings for your major components like motherboard, CPU, drives, and the total of that is going to be the baseline of our browser. So it tells you here to add up the wattage ratings for everything connected to your computer that uses the computer power supply, including motherboard, processor, memory, cards, drive, bus, power, USB, and other areas. If the local wattage use exceeds 70% of the wattage rating for your power supply, you should upgrade it to a higher power supply, a larger power supply. Considering that it would be the same with the form factor and it will fit in your existing case. And so as it progresses and it talks about different types of connector on the power supply and also the wires. Your red is going to be positive 5 volts, yellow is going to be positive 12 volts, orange is going to be positive 3.3 volts, black is going to be ground, purple is going to be positive 5 volts, green is going to be P5, gray is going to be that power is good, and white is going to be no connection. So as we mentioned, what are some of the consideration for upgrading or replacing power supply? This is on page 25. The wattage and the amperage, we want to go equivalent or higher. If we reach the 70% wattage, we want to go higher. Let's talk about printer. So laser printer is a page printer that stores the entire content of the page and then print it. Now, there are different types of printer: inkjet, thermal, and impact. And impact is on the older type of printer. So in the laser printer, you would have a toner cartridge where it would release the toner. You would use the magnetic to be able to inlay the toner, which gives you the print on the page. And toner cartridge sometimes goes bad. Toward the end of its life, you want to be able to rotate it back and forth, and so that way it evens out and it still might be able to print a few more pages. But commonly you would then replace the cartridge. And as you do so, you need to clean the area of the charging of that wire. So that way it would print clean, otherwise you would have a dirty print. So laser printer is not the only type of printer, but the image process laser printer is important. So the step for printing is located on page 27. Processing is the first step. Charging, exposing, developing, transferring, fusing, and cleaning are the subsequent steps. Now, in the processing part, the printer image is then received, and it's going to take that information for font, text, and graphics from the printer driver, and it's going to create an image and store that in the memory. Then we can answer the next question. We can say that the major components of the laser printer includes image drum, which applies the page image to the transfer belt on the roller. It's combined with toner supply in the toner cartridge. The second part is going to be the developer. It's going to pull the toner from the supply, and it's going to send it to the imaging drum, which then would combine it to apply it on the page. Transfer belt is transfer the page image onto the drum. Then next is going to be pick up rollers. That will be pick up paper. So it's going to be able to transfer sheets of paper through the roller. Paper separation pad is where it's going to be able to take one piece of paper at a time. Duplexing is an assembly that's turn the paper from front to back. That's called duplexing assembly. So here it describes all the processes. Make sure we understand all the processes for your laser, because you'll be asked on the exam, our exam, and certification for it. When you're using color, there are only three color and one black that's going to be used in a laser. You have cyan, magenta, yellow as one group, which are color cartridges, and then you have black only as a separate cartridge. Then in the laser media type, we touch on this as we answer the previous questions. So it talks about the specific type and the functionality of that type. So make sure you look it over. Another type of printer that's going to be popular is your inkjet printer. An inkjet printer is used for the smaller scale type of business or at home. It is, you can use it with color or different color print ink, and that will be your DPI size is typically 5760 to 440. So then you would see that laserjet printer is also used along with the inkjet for our general purpose. So then we would see how each of the components with the printer open here. Now, going back to the assignment, we would then answer the next question. It asks you what are the 7 steps in electrographic EP process. Just like what we talked about earlier, processing, charging, exposing, developing, transferring, fusing, and cleaning. And then at the end, you do see that laser printer does have little particles of ink that's left. So when you service the printer and fix it, you got to make sure that you vacuum it as you replace the cartridge for that printer. And on the last number 25, not the last one, but it asks you to identify the color toners in the color laser printer. And if you recall, we just talked about cayenne, magenta, and yellow. Those are the 3 colors that's used in the color printer. And then it has a separate black. So if you need to clean up the loose toner inside the laser printer, we would be able to prevent damage or dirt or dirty print, and we can use a vacuum to do that, a small hand vacuum. And compare laser printer to inkjet. What's the components for the inkjet printer? It also uses ink cartridge, but it uses print head, roller, feeder, duplicating agency, and orba. And the colors that are included with the inkjet printer are, again, cayenne, magenta, yellow, and black. They're the same color that we would use in laser printer, but just the cartridge are different. Different in size, different in length, and different in use. Now, the last type of printer that we're going to talk about is your laser printer. And the laser printer is used for receipts and other type of more glossy base output. So then your receipt printers, it uses heat to infuse the print onto your paper, and over time that paper gets faded because the ink gets absorbed or dissipates. Now, printer calibration is important. You can do this as part of the startup process of the printer. Here is where it would align the heads and making sure that it would be able to print straight lines. So if you have prints that are, the lines look crooked, then you need to realign and calibrate your printer. To do simple maintenance on your inkjet, you also need to clean the nozzle or have a head cleaning check. And the printer itself would complete this process if you specify it at the beginning or throughout the use of the printer. You can change the setting and allow it to do that. And we mentioned that thermal printer uses heat to transfer text onto paper. And it's available in 3 categories: dye sublimation, thermal wax, or direct thermal. So thermal wax is like the laser quality, dye sublimation is the highest in quality, and direct thermal is commonly used in thermal printing as the receipt. Their processes are different. So thermal heat and heating element is described here. And the process is also described on page 27. So here's a diagram on how you would be able to see the print head and the thermal print head. So there's a regular printed, or the thermal print head is able to apply the heat, so it would be heated up here. And we can use wax resin or a different type of heating mechanism there. And the paper for thermal printer is a specific type. It is more heat sensitized paper, which is usually glossy type of paper. And so we want to make sure that we would match the type of paper to the requirement of that printer. You can go to manufacturer website to look up the information if you don't see it on the machine itself or the box label. And we want to also choose the appropriate ribbon type, so that way it's going to print clearly. Thermal maintenance usually include things like replacing paper, cleaning heating element, removing debris, and then cleaning up the heating elements. So there's not a lot of like really essential area from comparing the thermal printer to the laser, where the laser would go through longer processes and also need additional maintenance. So then for our next questions, our last few questions, when would you use thermal printer? That will be used in a retail environment, point of sale system, transfer data to print on glass, when you're using wax media or short-term print. And for number 30, it asks you what are the components of the impact printer. So impact printer is very much like a typewriter where it would strike a key with ink onto the paper, and sometimes it would have a wheel of all the characters that it needs, and it would be able to press that onto the paper. So with that, the components of an impact printer is going to be print head, ink ribbon, pull push tractor, belt, and carriage. Now in the notes after the laser printer, it talks about impact printers. And while this is an older technology, you do see some companies still using this when they need to print carbon copy. And carbon copy is just two pieces of paper where you can print on top, and it would transfer, right, by pressure onto the second page. So invoices, receipts, things like that are still being used with the impact printer. And when you fix this, you will have to be familiar with the different components and how to be able to clean and maintain. Like what with thermal, you want to remove the debris, right? And then looking at the maintenance, compare that to inkjet or laser printer. So there is a printer section in CompTIA, and make sure we know how to be able to troubleshoot printer and know about different type of